Lawyers who have represented a murderer or a serial killer, what was it like? My dad was a lawyer and represented several murderers. One of the more interesting anecdotes is from my mom. When I was about 2, my dad hires an old client of his to babysit me. She is an older lady who watches me a few times. Later my mom discovered she was charged with the murder of her husband, ended up convicted of manslaughter, and was out after a few years. Mom gave my dad a lot of hell for allowing a murderer to babysit. His response? Well, it's not like Curious Pursuit is going to cheat on her. He has a point. Proceeds to cheat on her. I have defended 4 people charged with murder in their trials. All 4 were found guilty. One very likely did it, but there may have been mitigating circumstances we were not allowed to introduce at trial. One probably did it, but I'm not sure he had the required intent to be found guilty of murder. One certainly did it, but I truly believe at the time he was insane. The last one is the one that I think about still sometimes in the middle of the night. No physical evidence. No confession. No weapon. He was still found guilty, but I have my doubts. I've represented 3 murderers, but not in the criminal cases. 2 of the cases were where the murderer was sued by the family members of the person they killed. The insurance companies denied a defense, because intentional acts are almost always excluded from insurance policies, and the family of the murderer hired my firm to try to obtain insurance coverage. I never met the criminals, and we were able to successfully resolve the matter so that the families received some compensation. We do this all the time in civil cases, usually by us coaching their attorney how to properly plead the case to make the insurer responsible for having to pay for a defense, and then the insurer decides that it is cheaper to settle than it is to defend. The 3rd time, he had committed murder as a young man. Really, it was a bar fight that went too far, was convicted of 2nd-degree murder, sentenced to 20 to life, was model prisoner, paroled at 14 years, did his time, and had started a successful business as a real estate developer. Then in 2006, he was driving his truck, blew a tire, and veered into traffic, causing a significant crash. He hired us to sue his insurer when the insurer denied coverage. I didn't know until I was prepping him for his deposition that he had been a murderer, and I never would have guessed it in the first place. Fortunately, that didn't come out when he was deposed. We were able to recover a significant amount of money, mid-7 figures, for him, which he used to pay the people who he hurt when his tire blew out. Absolutely the nicest guy you could imagine. A decade later, he still pops into the office and brings us donuts occasionally. My father has been a criminal defense attorney for 30 years. He no longer takes those types of cases, homicide, serial murder, etc., because they do take an enormous toll on your mental well-being. My father is as calloused and confident as they make him, so if he is willing to admit that it rattles even his conscience, it must be some serious shit. Apparently, during one of his first cases back in his 20s, he had to represent a murderer who he believed to be 100% guilty. Could not go to sleep the night before trial, stayed up vomiting and crying all night long. Terry Gross on NPR's Fresh Air interviewed the famous criminal defense lawyer Richard Racehorse Haynes. He told of a time when he got someone acquitted. As the jury returned to the courtroom, he could tell from the various nods in his direction and smiles on the faces of the jury members that he had won the case. He leaned over to the defendant and told him the jury had been very kind to him, and that he should thank them. The acquittal was announced. The judge asked the defendant if he had anything to say. He rose and announced, "I'd like to thank the jury, and I promise I will never do it again." I never represented a serial killer, that I know of, but I represented quite a few murderers, and the answer is, they're much like the rest of us. There is no mark of Cain. Some of them have explosive tempers, but under US law that tends to mitigate the offense by negating premeditation. The rest were just swept away by alcohol, drugs, jealousy, narcissism, lot of that, and other unpleasant personality traits that most people will exhibit from time to time. Everybody gets angry. This common humanity means it's possible, indeed incumbent, on any criminal lawyer to develop good sentencing advocacy skills, meaning trying to find the best in people, then trying to make that core humanity clear to the court. Murderers need this most of all, regardless of whether the lawyer gets shit for arguing that murderer was a poor abused child. Duck it. They often were poor and abused, and it's your duty to make use of that evidence. Just a regular murderer, not a serial killer. It was fine. Here's the thing. You get into criminal defense law, you have to get used to the idea that you're going to be defending criminals. The criminal justice system isn't full of innocent people being railroaded and waiting for Matlock to show up and trap the star witness into admitting that she's really the killer. A really tiny number are factually innocent, a decent number did exactly what the police say they did. In the latter case, you're putting the crown to its proof, testing the evidence, testing the chain of custody or the witness's recollection or whatever. Looking not for a smoking gun of innocence but for a reasonable doubt. You're trying to get the best outcome possible for them, which might be a not guilty verdict but might be a conviction, or a guilty plea, on a lesser included charge. You do your best for everyone, right up to the limits of the law and the code of conduct. If you can't do your best, because you're conflicted about representing criminals, then, shocker, criminal law might not be for you. My only murderer was convicted of manslaughter. It was a fair outcome. I helped represent 3 murderers, all on death row, 1 at trial, and all 3 in post-conviction relief situations. They were interesting. I worked for one of the top death row defense attorneys in the nation. All of these men had mental health issues which their original attorneys failed to explore and use as either a defense or as mitigation at sentencing. While I didn't feel any sympathy for what they did, including a 6 feet 7 inches 270 pounds dude who looked like an NFL tight end or linebacker who brutally murdered an old lady with a screwdriver over a $200 Social Security check, it was sad to see how their original lawyers had failed to adequately protect their rights. At the end of the day, it's all the same whether I'm representing a dumb college kid in municipal court who got too drunk at the bar and started a fight with a bouncer, or someone accused of murder. Lawyer here. I was a public defender for 5 years, now private practice because I make 10x as much. I'm going to speak more generally, because a lot of homicide cases are just not that interesting. Half the time the defendant brags about how this is what happens when you duck with me and thinks that doesn't implicate him, he confesses, or there's overwhelming evidence. I have no moral qualms about defense. It's important and the Sixth Amendment guarantees the right to counsel. Some have said that the reason it's important that defendants have access to counsel because it makes sure any convictions stick. I find that line of reasoning utter bullshit. The reason I work in criminal defense is twofold. 1, it is, quite literally, the only way the system works. The system will become corrupt with no criminal defense. 2, the system is completely biased against the defendants. Without counsel, they will be completely chewed up and spit out, and their punishment will extend far beyond the magnitude of the crime they may have actually committed. One example of how the system is biased against the defendants can be seen in overcharging. You have no idea how common overcharging is. When I was a public defender, it happened about 99% of the time. The state would overcharge just so they have an extra tool to use during plea negotiations. And they usually got away with it because most public defenders are overworked. Another example of the systematic bias is that prosecution doesn't always play by the rules, and you need someone on the defense to call them out on it. I was once defending a young gentleman who had a long list of charges. He'd been in and out of the justice system his entire life, and most recently, at the time, he had allegedly broke into several vehicles, stole their radios, and assaulted one vehicle owner that caught him. The prosecution called a community member that lived near him to the stand. A community member that had no standing to testify. And they would have gotten away with it if it weren't for me. They're sneaky, and obviously he didn't know they didn't have standing to testify. I guess that doesn't answer your question. The TLDR is I have no moral qualms about it, but all my murderer or serial killer cases have been boring and none have been high profile. One of my law professors represented John Wayne Gacy on his appeal, and has represented many alleged and convicted murderers. He said it's really easy defending someone you know or think is guilty because all you're there for is to make sure the state proves its case and follows the rules. When you have someone you believe to be innocent that gets convicted though, that was what keeps him up at night. So, apparently it's not tough representing actual killers. I get asked this a lot. I have represented horrible people accused of horrible things. But the fact remains that they are owed a fair trial and the state still needs to prove the facts beyond a reasonable doubt, which is difficult. If the state cannot meet their burden, the accused goes free. This is our system. I appreciate this answer. From a legal perspective, most of such cases are pretty clear-cut and therefore rather boring legal-wise. The most interesting cases are those where the law and facts are in a conflict, for instance cases where the letter of the law says the defendant should be punished but common sense says he doesn't. Those are hallmark cases that shape a legal system. A case where Stabby McMurderer stabs 8 people isn't all that interesting, Most of the time there is a lot of evidence against Stabby. Stabby probably confessed or is gloating about his crime. If he is found sane, he gets put away for life. Cases, however, where the judge runs into a problem are interesting from a legal perspective. A famous case in the Netherlands was one of a veterinarian that knowingly exposed cows to a certain mild form of cowpox, a bovine disease. Knowingly spreading livestock diseases is banned, so he should be punished. However, the veterinarian argued that he exposed the cows to the bovine disease in order to immunize them to a certain more aggressive form of cowpox. This was a problem legal-wise. The veterinarian admitted he committed the crime, spreading a disease, but he argued that he did it with the aim of preventing worse. In the end, he was acquitted. The court had to accept that sometimes a certain offense cannot result in a conviction if the defendant's aim was just. From a strictly legal point of view, such cases are rather boring. Then again, I am not a lawyer. I studied law and legal philosophy. These are just my 0.02. A family friend of ours, her brother represented a very notable American mobster from the 70s. When my parents spoke to her about it, she had said she herself was worried, but he wasn't. The thing with this mobster was that it was already known he killed the people he did and was on the run. They weren't trying to prove his innocence, and at that point this man had made some choice decisions with law enforcement that really hurt his reputation with any surviving members of his gang. So the trial itself was very cut and dry. Mostly about helping his sentence, making sure he wasn't going to be put into any random federal prison. He had specific needs, relevant to the decisions he made with the law, and he would not be safe if he was put in any prison, and he was. I doubt it was very exciting beyond the media presence. Trying to keep names on the down low to prevent giving out private information. But I'm sure a lot of you guys will be able to figure out who this man was. Edit. Some of you guys have guessed it already. It was Bulger. I was mostly hiding it because I didn't want to release too much info in my comment, but mods clearly are fine with people sharing it in the comments, so I'm sure it's okay if I share it here. It's all public record anyway. Worked on a case where a young man murdered his father on CCTV. It was multiple rounds of shots to the head. Very cut and dry. Very interesting to see the case be thrown out due to incorrect police investigation. Eventually got recharged with a lesser crime and served a few months in a mental institution. Unless you're just looking for brief generalized answers, I recommend the book that John Wayne Gacy's lawyer wrote about defending him. It's fascinating and very well written. They knew each other before the crimes, too. Called John Wayne Gacy, Defending a Monster, by Sam Amarante, his lawyer. I think something a lot of people are missing when they have thoughts such as, how could someone defend someone who did X and Y? Is that all the rights and amendments geared towards criminal defense weren't made with just psychopaths and serial killers in mind? They were made thought of for every person to enjoy, regardless of the charge. To defend those rights for all means all have to be defended. Somewhat relevant story. Not a lawyer, but work in child welfare, and when I was a CPS caseworker, I removed a child from a murderer. Got a call from law enforcement, showed up at the family home, law enforcement everywhere. They had literally just arrested this woman for murder, and she was in the cop car while I was talking to the sheriff and helping the 6-year-old put a bag of his belongings together. Met with her at the county jail, floor-to-ceiling plexiglass between us, her in full shackles, where she was bawling and saying things like, "I can't believe they have me locked up in here like some kind of killer," and whatnot. Shortly after, I saw her again in juvenile court. As the caseworker, I have a front row seat in the courtroom and she was directly in front of me. During a pre-hearing conference, she turned around to participate in the discussion and our knees were literally about 6 inches apart. The rage in her eyes, seriously all I could see was her lunging at my, biting my jugular to kill me. She was cuffed. Don't worry, this didn't happen. Less than 2 months later she was found guilty, sent to a women's prison. Fast forward about 6 months where I saw her again. Turns out she was pregnant when she was arrested and had just given birth when I saw her again at the hospital, this time to place her newborn baby in state custody. She was cuffed to the hospital bed with essentially a taser bracelet around her ankle. Saw her again at the juvenile court hearing for T, his child, where she went off in court blaming me for her children entering foster care. By the end of everything, she didn't even try to claim her innocence anymore, had continued saying she was innocent after found guilty. A few years back her brother was also convicted of multiple murders here. The local paper did like a 4-page spread on this family and their criminal history, talking about the criminal gene and the killer gene because of the vast familial history of related violent crimes. Just crazy. Not to jack the initial question, But with this Larry Nassar case that is going on, I start to wonder about his lawyers. Like, how do you defend a child predator? I understand and believe fully that he deserves a fair trial, so he deserves representation, but I wonder how a firm takes that defense. They removed me from the courtroom and said I wasn't allowed to practice law. I call BS. Username checks out. I'm a lawyer that works for a lawyer who used to do exclusively criminal defense representation. Early on in his career he represented a guy that had killed his ex-girlfriend, and there was pretty much no denying the guy did it. So the trial strategy was to admit the client did it, but try to get him off by claiming temporary insanity. Client said he has no recollection of anything. The details of the murder were pretty grim. The victim was beaten, restrained, and was shot in the back after she ran outside. The guy then stood over her and shot her execution style in the street. The temporary insanity angle didn't work and he was convicted of first-degree murder. Client later tried to get his conviction overturned for ineffective assistance of counsel, claiming that my boss should never have used the trial strategy of admitting to the murder. That claim also didn't work. Thanks for listening to another episode of Reddit X. Subscribe and activate the notification bell so you won't miss any stories. Feel free to share your own stories below in the comments. Have a good day.